Welcome back to Hell to Pay podcast. This week we're without Arma, but we do have a friend back with us.
Yay, I'm Sipo. Very glad to be back. I've had a wild couple of weeks, so I'm calling in from Cape Town at the moment, fresh from a friend's wedding that lasted like 5 days. But
Is that a Zulu wedding?
yeah, glad to be back. No, very much white person and colored person, but they live overseas, so they sort of it was an opportunity to see everybody. So yeah, lots of fun. I had to take like a 12-hour nap when I came back. So yeah, but I'm glad to be back. And let's keep Mo in our prayers. He's been renditioned too now.
He has. He's somewhere in the Canadian wilderness. Yeah, potentially being tariffed.
So we're recording, 2 days after it was announced that Pope Francis has died. And yeah, what an interesting time on just watching everybody's reactions and also thinking about what an extraordinary time his period was. How do you say for a pope? It's not a reign per se, although he is a monarch, I guess, in a sense.
Papacy, I think,
Right.
is the
A papacy, let's say. The interesting one was watching the fringe, the right side of the mainstream American politics have nastier comments about his death than us, who had a very sort of, a sober, very sorry to everybody, like as you would say if you're being proper about this. And then I saw Hezbollah, I think, as well, who had a very sober statement. And then all the Protestants going, "Wah!" All the American Protestants losing their minds over this.
Yeah, I missed that Hamas and Hezbollah had made statements, but yeah, there's an American, like, I think he's probably the most influential evangelical in America today, Lance Wallnau. He posted he quote tweeted Barack Obama's tweet with a picture of himself and the Pope, and just saying, looking at these two, you've got to think that, this is the Antichrist is on his way.
Oh, God.
So, yeah, it really has brought out the worst instincts, I think, particularly in the American church, because it has gone so right-wing and so overtly politicized. And so, Catholics aren't a lot of Catholics here aren't going to be sticking up for him. They're very much in bed
Right,
with
yes.
the evangelical point of view.
Yeah, and even with I was going to say that even ostensible Catholics who can't just swallow this one and just offer condolences for the passing of a holy leader have to have a dig. But, it does speak to the legacy that Pope Francis is going to have. And I say this as someone who was brought up in the non-denominational Protestant, but very Lutheran influenced sort of movement in South Africa. So obviously we were never taught good things about the Pope and the Roman Catholic Church, but to watch just how Pope Francis basically interpreted his role and how he spoke. One of the most outspoken critics of capitalism, you could say, over the last few years. We know about how he called the church in Gaza every single day, and apparently did so on the morning of his death, or was it the day before? So he kept that up every day. He did Easter service, the traditional Sunday service from the balcony in Rome, as one does. Now that we know what we know, he was obviously in very, very frail health, but he still did it, So an amazing legacy as popes go. I don't think it's a surprise anybody that I'm quite critical of the church and the position and so on, just given its history. But the way that he was able to interpret his role and speak for the marginalized and the poor, I think is going to leave an amazing legacy. My fear now is that the College of Cardinals is going to way overcorrect, and we're going to go back to the days, especially the 20th century popes, the sort of how to put this, the people who picked out anti-communism and sort of like almost like picked a side in the whole Cold War and made that their whole thing, and were all very staunchly socially conservative and so on.
So interestingly, one of the things that I sort of touched on in the first episode we did on the Vatican financial scandal is that Francis was quite a good administrator. And he was quite, he was he was very dedicated to trying to clean up the church. Wasn't particularly successful in terms of the corruption and the financial issues. But one he did do was, because basically, a pope appoints cardinals and then cardinals appoint a pope. And so he's basically been branch stacking since he's been in. So he now has, I think it's over 75 or 80% of the cardinals he appointed, because they age out now at 80. So he has like a supermajority. It just depends. And I mean, obviously there's a lot of politics and regional stuff that goes on, and, they're not all going to be exactly aligned with him. But yeah, they're obviously people that he's fairly on board with, or, could at least, perhaps do a deal with. So I think that'll be interesting just to see how those chips fall. But what's really amused me the most is that because there are so few, they've all died or aged out, of the really culture warrior, right? It's kind of hard overlaying secular politics onto the Vatican, but, your George Pells and people like that I spoke about in the Vatican episode, a lot of them are gone now. And so the one that the ultra-conservatives are really getting behind, especially in the US, is Cardinal Sarah of Guinea. Like they're all in on the Pope guy.
And watching people who get their politics from social media and interpret everything. Well, first of all, the American binary in politics, and then interpolating that thanks to social media brain rot, and then forcing that onto the structure and the politics of the Catholic Church. So watching them trying to wrap their heads around that they might need to root for the Black Pope in order to get the most socially conservative one, right? Which is going to cause a lot of very, very interesting madnesses that are going to come out of this. But just for the sake of observation as an outsider, having a non-white Pope is going to be interpreted obviously as this major, I don't know, like it's going to be read as having social ramifications, right? And is this change? Is this evolution in the church, and so on and so on? And you might actually see people trying to sort of separate out the way that social change has been spoken about over the last 100 years as being, this quite liberalized project around representation and identity and so on, versus the actual issues and the politics themselves. So as we're saying that, putting in an African Pope in hopes that he is actually far more socially conservative and actually takes them back to, older ideas, shall we say, pre-Francis ideas around, all the things that he spoke about in the way that he did. Although some people are pointing out, of course, that Francis had a very publicized homophobic slur incident, which he then repeated afterwards, even after he apologized.
Yeah.
So anyways.
Classic old bloke behavior.
Exactly. In any case, we're talking about the head of the Church of Rome here. So we really are grading on a curve when we're talking about change and evolution and so on. But, you can hope. I've seen so many people writing on social media about how this guy's acceptance of gay couples and so on actually changed things on the ground. And so the local homophobic bully suddenly cuts it out because the Pope said so, So we can live in hope, but we never know.
Yeah, I think we can definitely maybe do I've sort of spoken about it after that first Vatican episode we did, and, definitely doing a second one on the 70s financial scandal. But yeah, maybe we can revisit the Pope election once it all comes out in the wash.
Yeah, it will be. And then, for me, if nobody else, to get to know who these cardinals are. As I say, I've been brought up in a completely different church, so I have no idea who any of them are. So that would be an interesting, sort of almost feels like, we keep trying to avoid forcing American politics onto this, but thanks to social media especially, that's just all we know now. And so who's the Hillary, who's the Trump, who's the Bernie?
Yeah. In the blue corner. Ding, ding, ding.
Yeah. But any case, let's move on, because I'm very excited actually for today's topic, something that is very near and dear to my heart. So today we're going to be speaking about the Satanic Panic, but specifically as it played out in South Africa. Now, obviously, as someone who's written about the global Pentecostal movement and so on, you're going to be very aware of what we're talking about. But I wanted to give you a little view, a little window into how it played out in South Africa and how it was, inevitably tied up with apartheid. I spoke in my first host episode about Elon Musk and the far right in South Africa and how they were inevitably tied up with the apartheid state. And this is kind of like pulling out a version of that, the more sort of like fever dream aspect of apartheid South Africa, and basically how this completely closed off paranoid society digested the end of apartheid and basically emerging into a globalized world. And I think that in that sense, it does tie into the global satanic panic and basically why this bizarre movement happened in the first place and why it had such cultural valence. Right. I was brought up in a very evangelical environment, and my first childhood memories really start sort of early 90s. One of the memories that has stuck with me is watching the older boys that I was growing up with telling me that I basically had to prepare for the day when the communists are going to come and they're going to kill everybody. And so they were constantly doing like these prepper things. And so I remember this one guy took us, the church where I was brought up in, the actual church building itself is quite massive. It's like a 60,000 seater, and it's built on a hill. Underneath the church, they had these big sewers that would wash out rainwater, because we're talking about the subtropical part of South Africa, and so the summer rain especially is pretty hectic. So this huge roof would catch all this water and it would wash it out in these big sewers that we as little boys could crawl up, right? So we could crawl up all the way under the church to the other side. Yeah, it was an amazing adventurous space. Of course, now as an adult, I'm what on earth were we thinking, etc. But I'm sure the young boys growing up there now still do it. But in any case, one day one of the older boys takes us in there, and deep in the sewer, we come across his prepper stash. So he had biltong hidden there. He had tins of stuff hidden there, and this was also when the communists come that we could hide up there. He was prepared for this event. So now you're talking. This is now after 1994. So the elections have happened, and we are now in what is now understood to be new South Africa. But the sensations and the panic and the paranoia of especially white South Africa realizing that the old is over and they don't know what the new is going to be lasted for a really long time, and in many ways it's still with us. So that's why, even though I'm talking about probably 97, 98, around then, you're still having people talking about the fear of the communists coming, and then the one that ran alongside it was the fear of an invasion of Satanists. So there was a period when people saw a Satanist absolutely everywhere. Yeah, go ahead.
So was the fear of communism, was that like multiracial, or was this more like of a religious thing? Like, was the boys that you went to school with like doing prepping stuff, were they Zulu or were they white kids?
So this is very much a white society thing. So because I grew up in one of the few genuinely multiracial groups, and it was specifically this church, right? A lot of these fears and panics that otherwise were only within white South Africa, we absorbed them and saw them. But also, this is in what was Natal at the time, or the Zulu Kingdom. There was also a sense that the ANC was something to be feared and hated, and it was the IFP, or the Inkatha Freedom Party, which was the Zulu Nationalist Party, that was the one that represented people's interests, right? So, but it was very much a white society thing, and we'll get into that a little bit as we go on. And so, but the overall sensation and the overall feeling was this idea that, so white society under apartheid was Calvinist, it is right-wing, it is incredibly insular. And also it was understood that the state sort of protected and looked over this state, right? And as a Calvinist society as well, obviously extremely patriarchal. And so the boundaries of the family unit were policed very drastically. And it was understood that the state then represented on a bigger level the same relationship with the people. So you start having incidents occur that kind of shake that relationship, and the end of apartheid is absorbed and understood in that particular way. So people don't see the apartheid state as this pariah state that's falling apart. Rather, they are malign forces that are acting against not just the state but the family, and the government is failing to protect us. And eventually, by the time you get to the late 1980s, the white society itself has sort of, it sees the apartheid states as having failed and understands that, oh my God, there needs to be, or this thing is coming to an end, but I don't know what comes next, right? So you can think of it in the words of Antonio Gramsci, talking about the old is dying and the new cannot be born. And in this interregnum, a great deal of morbid symptoms appear. So the Satanic Panic in South Africa, we're talking about this period of morbid symptoms. And we'll talk a little bit also about how it's about a society that cannot face the problems within itself directly. And so creates the devil as the cause, or communists as the cause of these things that appear in society. And just regular social change that comes about thanks to globalization is interpreted as Satanism or the devil quite literally attacking the country.
I've been thinking a lot recently about this in the context of Israel. I mean, obviously, what's happening to Palestinians and people in Gaza in particular is just horrific beyond words. But, the psychic damage that the Israeli state and the Israeli people are going to be dealing with for a long time. I have been thinking about that a lot.
Yeah.
And I suppose that maybe the closest analog is going to be, white apartheid South Africa.
Yeah, that is actually a perfect example, because it doesn't happen to, I would say, society that is regular, or at least society that doesn't have to go through a traumatic change very, very quickly. It happens to societies that have something wrong inside of them. And instead of tackling that directly, suddenly you're trying to find reasons for why things are going wrong that aren't the obvious thing that is staring everybody in the face. Yeah, and so going back to South Africa now, this is what is very interesting about the local scene, right? So we understand the global satanic panic to have been, so it starts in North America in the early 1980s, and by the time it ends, I would say this is about a 10-year period where this thing is really going around the world. And in my research, I found out that they had satanic panics in countries I couldn't imagine, like Finland and Turkey. It really went global. I think most people will know and understand, or at least people who've heard of the Satanic Panic will remember it as, well, it starts off with the publication of the book Michelle Remembers, which is written by Canadian psychiatrists. And, they're talking about recovered memories of this horrific satanic rituals that happened to her as a child. And obviously, there's no evidence, there's no real evidence behind this. And we're going to keep saying this over and over, by the way. This thing just explodes around the world, right? And then there's the famous case in California of the McMartin preschool, which actually goes to court, and the staff at the preschool are accused of all kinds of things. It stokes this nationwide paranoia, and needless to say, completely destroys the lives of the people who get accused. And what's interesting in the American case, at least, and I'm sure in the UK and other places as well, as I've said that this thing went global, was that it is very much around repressed childhood memories. It is very much around little children in daycare. And the people who lead this thing and the people who are the voices and the experts in this are all psychologists and psychiatrists, right? So it has a sheen of scientific rigor, shall we say. That is not the case whatsoever in South Africa. In South Africa, it's not about child abuse. It's not about a psychiatrist and so on. This is people who thought that the devil was real. was a real entity, a real person who is coming over from the West and is coming to South Africa, and he is spreading his evil influence amongst the white population. And there is a huge concern that young people especially are being led astray, and the symptoms of it, that we're speaking, so they're speaking about moral decay. They're speaking about how young white people are changing, and how this is a sign that obviously that Satan has now come here. So I said that there was a huge panic around communism and anti-communism. Well, not in the sense that it became a movement per se, but in the sense that it was just there all the time under rule. So that was called Rooi Gevaar, or the Red Danger in Afrikaans. It actually builds on
Reds Under the Bed.
Yeah, so it's Red Scare basically, right? And so it builds on what was called Swart Gevaar. Now, Swart Gevaar is very interesting because that one goes all the way back to the 1940s, when the National Party takes control, and it basically, and the ruling power under South Africa shifts from the far more moderate, I think it was called the South African Party, or the Unity Party, or the South Africa Party, which had been led by people like Louis Botha and Jan Smuts, people who are far more connected to the Commonwealth. That was basically the milieu of South Africa at the time, which was a much more, look, don't get me wrong, it's still a colony, right? And it's still under the Commonwealth. And as we covered last time when we spoke about Elon Musk, still is part of the British colonial project, but it's the Commonwealth, right? And then 1948 happens, and there was a commission of inquiry actually called the Sauer Commission. And that's where this paranoia about the masses of black people who surround us versus this tiny population of white people is crystallized into the apartheid movement. And that's how the National Party, which is Calvinist, Afrikaner, very rural based, even though the population is rapidly urbanizing and so on and so on, that's where it comes out of. So Swart Gevaar is one of those underpinnings of apartheid that go much further back than the Satanic panic moment happened. So these things build on each other, right? And then critically, after the 1976 Soweto uprising, South Africa is turned into a pariah state internationally, right? So South Africa gets kicked out of sports, it gets kicked out of all kinds of cultural and international bodies, and so on and so on and so on. So I think that's when the penny drops that apartheid South Africa is something that is set apart from the rest of the world. Now, what's very interesting as well is that I think that because of how completely closed off South African society is at that point, that the resultant economic collapse, for example, the white South Africans under apartheid don't necessarily connect, so for example, unemployment amongst white people shoots up after the sanctions hit, right? They don't connect that necessarily to the effects of the apartheid state. The apartheid states, they still have this very father and children relationship where the state looks after us and this is who protects us and so on. So when these bad things happen and they're scratching around for whose fault is it, obviously now their minds go to, it must be the fault of the devil, basically.
You know what's interesting? I mean, there is a pretty strong school of thought, I believe, now in the US that the Satanic Panic was a response to, mothers going into the workforce and suddenly, putting their kids into daycare and just this kind of like mass society psychosis about it. So it is really interesting that those you said they obviously have like quite different genesis, but just that like sudden, society-wide change just sort of sends people into just complete hysteria.
Yeah. And it's interesting that something else I didn't know before really like delving for this episode is that there were actually two peaks of the Satanic Panic. The first one happens in the early 1980s, and then the second one in the late 1980s. And that first 1980s one is tied around the effects of the sanctions and so on. And then the late 1980s one is tied around having to face the end of apartheid. What's very interesting is that because of 1976, and now apartheid South Africa having to react more and more to its isolation, and people basically treating this as like a cancer that needed to be cut out from the rest of the world, is that South Africa does start to open up, actually. After 1976, I believe television is introduced to South Africa for the first time in the late 1970s.
It's so wild.
After 1976, as a way of showing actually we are a normal country. Look, our children are allowed to watch TV. But obviously this is extremely censored. There's only like one television station at first. Everything has to go through an apartheid censor. And so even within this idea that the country's opening up and so on, it merely manifests the extreme social control that's happening under the apartheid state. So then the second peak of the Satanic Panic, the one that I sort of live in the afterglow of as I'm growing up in the 90s, it is really pushed in churches. It is pushed by institutions such as the media. I mean, it's incredible if I think up, because I've been a journalist most of my career. It's incredible to think about how sharply the media has had to change in South Africa, because back then people would write articles and basically say, oh yeah, the fact that we're seeing more and more people wearing jeans, more and more people, like, you started, like, taking drugs started becoming a thing, whereas it wasn't at all before. Things like, obviously, you have the counterculture movement in the United States. And as the counterculture movement is actually fading and evolving, shall we say, and turning into something else at the end of the 70s into the 80s, in South Africa, it suddenly arrives. That's the point when it arrives. And so the very first Afrikaners who are starting to make blues music, who are starting to make rock music and so on, they are the ones who are directly blamed. So as I said, in South Africa, this is taken as the devil is literally real, you know, and he's this bad guy from the 19th century is tricking your children into being horny. This kind of stuff is taken up by the police, and it's bizarre because I mean, that's not what's unique about it, but it's what they're pointing to, that the police have to investigate, right? So one of the articles I read spoke about how changing hairstyles was seen as a sign of Satanism. So the bob haircut, which today is completely ubiquitous in South Africa and is actually hilariously anachronistic, because so many people in South Africa have these 80s hairstyles, right? It's like once it was accepted that the people could just have this hairstyle, now we can't move on from it. I guess because there's still a fear that if I change my haircut, people will think that I'm a Satanist now. There was a huge scandal over whether or not women were allowed to come to church without wearing a hat. That was taken as a sign of the spread of Satanism. The actual cases themselves, the actual evidence that is used to show that there's the effects of the devil are all, they sort of sit on either side of the spectrum. They are frivolous and ridiculous on the one hand, as I've been saying, right? And then obviously things like suddenly more young people are interested in alternative culture. So more young people are interested in goth music and in heavy metal, wearing black, you know, things like that. You can imagine how that's taken, right? And obviously because no one was listening to Black Sabbath, no one was allowed to play Black Sabbath on the radio or even something like the Rolling Stones or something. It was all being spread via secret cassettes. And it was actually quite interesting how in my youth, we were listening to things on CDs and then MP3s. But the culture of spreading music friend to friend via a secret recording was still well and alive in the 2000s, coming out of the apartheid era. But then, so on the one hand, you've got what we can call silly and frivolous, like Satanic Panic. But then on the other hand, you have actual cases of murder and actual cases of violence that get taken up by the police, and almost immediately you'll find some minister or bishop or someone like that, and then in some cases it will be driven by some editor or some magazine editor or something who will force the Satanic Panic interpretation onto the events. And so that's all that people see in that case, right? And they completely dismiss any explanations that are outside of the Satanic Panic interpretation, including psychological explanations. So it's very interesting how in South Africa, until very recently, psychiatry and psychology was discredited I'm in favor of religious explanations for social phenomena.
Oh, sorry. I remember when I was researching my book, because I had a chapter on South Africa, the Pentecostal movement there, and how it's really tied into, a lot of traditional culture and things like that. And there was some insane stat that there was there like 2 or 3 faith healers for every doctor in South Africa?
Oh yeah, that's very likely, yeah. But the interesting thing is that, the interesting researchers who've gone into this have pointed out how African traditional religion could not be taken seriously under colonial law and apartheid law. So there would be cases where there's a very famous case, I think it's Rex versus Mbombela, I think it's called, that happens in the 1920s or the 1930s, where this guy Mbombela kills a child, and his argument in court is that he was 100% certain that he was being attacked by a Dokoloshe. Now, a Dokoloshe in South Africa, I think the best corollary would be a zombie. So it's basically someone, a witch will, or a warlock. Is that how you say the male version? I found that out like last year, that the word witch is actually gendered. That they will dig up a fresh body and then using a combination of medication or medicine. So in traditional African ideology, there's actually the difference between medicine and like a potion that I use to cast spells over is not the substance, it's my intention as a person wielding it. Medication and potions have the same word, which is the Zulu word for tree as well. Trees are also understood to be the source of medicine. Any case, so to make Utokolosha, you take your medicine and you use it to cast the spell, but you're also supposed to put a nail into the head, which then will magically shrink the body from, say, someone who's 5'10" or whatever, into the size of like only a meter tall or something like that. So like 3 feet tall. And then they can send this thing as an emissary of their bad intentions, right? So I can send this thing to say, go and cause someone to have bad nightmares or someone's premature death, or say send this thing to go and kill all of someone's cattle or something like that, right? So this guy says, and by the way, till today in South Africa, if you go into certain homes, you'll see that the beds are elevated, including people will put like cinder blocks or bricks under the feet of their bed so that they raise it up. It's the belief that the Tikolosho will then be too short to be able to reach up and touch you and then thus do its evil deeds onto you. But
sounds like we should do a whole episode on we should do a whole episode on Zulu mythology at some time.
We can. It would be, there are all kinds of fascinating stories about it. But the thing about it in the context of this is that white colonial law doesn't accept that as real. So the Satanic Panic is an introduction of European cosmology into South Africa. So they're saying that the devil is coming from Europe in the same way that they saw communism as this malign force coming out of Europe and infecting this Calvinist society at the bottom of Africa. But they reject the African ideas around spirituality and around cosmology, even as they consider them to be the devil's work and so on, right? So their interpretation of African spirituality is these people are, these soft brains Africans who don't really know anything. They think that they're worshipping their ancestors or whatever, but they're just misguided, right? And in one famous case of the Satanic Panic situation happening in a black school, that was pretty much the only recorded case of a major Satanic Panic incident in which psychiatrists and psychologists led the investigation, and it wasn't some pastor, because they are interpreting this as, these blacks, let's have a look. There must be some irrationality happening in their heads for them to think this nonsense, right? But when it happens to white people, call the pastor now. The devil has come, right? So the devil in this case is a Europeanized one, and he is part of the Christian and Calvinist ideas of good versus evil. So it's very important to point that out, actually. So for example, you have the Orso murder in 1992 in which a white teenager named Charmaine also stabs her mother to death in what is described as a satanic killing. The journalists who are there in the a courtroom and who interview the people around the case, they speak about pentagrams, and she wore black, and she was fascinated with heavy metal, etc., etc. And in spite of the fact that there was no evidence offered to tie Charmaine also to occultism, this was nevertheless written as Satanic Panic. And in fact, her boyfriend then, because he participated, he speaks about how the devil had actually come in there and had infected them, and this is why they did what they did, right? Obviously, later interpretations are of this clearly disturbed girl who tricks her very weak-minded boyfriend into committing this act of murder. So, like you raise a young psychopath in the home and then they eventually kill you. What's that one movie? I think we need to talk about Kevin.
Many
I
such
think
cases.
it is. So that's the vibe, right? But of course it gets written about as a satanic killing, right? And this panic, people latch onto this because how does this good Christian Afrikaans girl fall into such a sensationalized and crazy act, right? Must be the devil. And then after that, there's a famous case in the Northern Cape. So if you have a basic idea of South Africa in your head, this is the northwest corner of South Africa in the desert, in a town called Rietfontein, which is not very far from the border with Namibia today. Girls at a school, and again, white Afrikaners, right? Girls at the school start reporting attacks by an invisible entity, right? Some say that they had been scratched and they'd been pushed by this invisible entity, and the whole town panics. And because the town freaks out, the whole country freaks out. There are emergency meetings. Pastors come from all over South Africa to come in and cast demons and so on, and cast spells and chase out the demons and lay hands and so on and so on and so on, right? And only later do psychologists actually work with these girls, and they say it's a case of mass hysteria here, clearly. And also no evidence, no physical evidence, over and over again, as I said, there's no evidence of this aside from everybody deciding that this must be a satanic panic. And what was interesting as I was reading some of the research that was done was that Rietfontein is right on the border, or close to the border, with Namibia. Before Namibia declares independence from South Africa under a black nationalist movement, right? From apartheid South Africa. So that's the reason why the wars that the apartheid state was fighting against nationalist movements, and including Cuban soldiers who beat the hell out of them. Even though they were being fought in southern Angola, they're called the border wars in South Africa because Namibia was thought of as this contiguous part of the Calvinist apartheid state. And then suddenly the blacks have managed to split off Namibia and turn it into its own country. So that had a major effect, and that's why Rietfontein becomes the site of this satanic panic. And then, as I said, another case in the 90s that was quite famous. Yeah.
Sorry. Quick shout out to Alma, I think for one of our episodes that got consigned to history, for calling the Cubans in Angola one of the great away day victories in all of history.
Yes. We should revisit that and do like a proper episode on the border wars, because
we need That's your job, I think.
Interviewed people who are on the losing side of that, and the way that they interpret that in very interesting and very sort of febrile and religious ways, like losing that war. Any case, another famous case in Attridgeville. So Attridgeville is a township just outside of Pretoria. This happens at a black school. So this is in the townships where several children collapsed during morning prayers, allegedly under the influence of spirits. The difference there was that everyone around reacts to that with suspicion, right? So they're saying, nah, this can't be real. This is unruly children. This is just mentally ill children. As I said, suddenly psychologists get to lead this. These are just delinquent children, right? And so that double standard between who is considered under the same effects of, or manifesting the same effects, who is considered to be an innocent person being attacked by an outside malign force and who's considered just being idiotic or stupid or mentally ill. And there you see how the satanic panic was white racial panic, really, actually.
Yeah, so that was the question that I had. Was the subtext of this always that, these white kids are going crazy because the commies are here, the blacks are liberated, everyone's getting their hair cut and listening to Black Sabbath? Was that kind of always what was the undercurrent there?
So in a word, yes, right? And there are many different manifestations and many different flavors of this thing. But in its general sort of, if you take a giant step back, apartheid is coming to an end. White society is not sure what comes next. Obviously, then these Calvinists fill their heads with images of the devil attacking their children. And I think it's the panic over children especially is about the future, right? So what is happening to our young Afrikaans, good, upstanding children that these things are happening to them? Obviously, by the way, homosexuality, that's read as Satanism. Cohabiting. Yeah. Oh my God. I remember even in the 90s and 2000s, the idea that unmarried people lived together is seen as an assault on the family and is thus satanic. So yeah, people had huge freakouts about that. I am indebted to research by Professors Nicky Falkof and Danielle Dunbar and Sandra Swart, who have done extensive research around this, usually looking at the media reaction about what was going on. And I am indebted to their notes about this. So basically, their interpretation of what's going on here is you've got this incredibly sick society that cannot address the problem for what it is, and so has to look at other reasons other than what directly faces them. So obviously, you'd be surprised how many people till today who were on the other side of apartheid, on the white side of apartheid, will tell you that they had no idea anything was wrong until it all came collapsing around their ears. And the level of censorship of information, the level of segregation and isolation, in many cases makes that literally true. But also, obviously, there's that psychological protection of oneself, right? Of viewing all black people as this enormous threat that's coming to get you, and so you ghettoize yourself, you ghettoize black people into townships and so on. You never meet them, you never see, but the state slowly loses control and slowly loses their ability to hold everything together. I could talk to you about what was actually happening on the ground versus what the interpretation amongst these cloistered people actually were. So one of the things that was happening on the ground in the 1980s is you suddenly have the defiance movement. You suddenly have, post the banning of the ANC and PAC and and the South African Communist Party, obviously, and other movements like that, Mandela, etc., all in jail. You have about a 5-year period, 10-year period where there isn't quite an overt anti-apartheid movement. But in the 1980s, it suddenly springs up again in the domestic scene, churches, social clubs, trade unions, etc., etc. That's where the movement springs up. And now it becomes obvious that there's an anti-apartheid movement. So I can almost forgive that interpretation of what the hell's going on out of nowhere, and suddenly our society is collapsing around us. But Professor Nicky Falkof especially points out, and I'm going to use the next satanic panic example as an example of South Africa has a serious gender-based violence problem, and it is everywhere, and it is impossible to ignore. But it is so difficult to confront it on those terms because it has implications on so many things in society that people take to be normal. So South African society is quite patriarchal, right? And gender-based violence is a manifestation of that. But it's impossible to tackle patriarchy if you're not going to confront it as such. So a young girl called Kirsty Theologo, this happens in 2011, right? So we're talking, this is after the 2010 World Cup in South Africa. Okay, this is a year before Nelson Mandela dies. Yeah, so basically, a 17-year-old girl goes out into the field with her friends, and they used to do this all the time. So it's these young white girls who are hanging out and socializing with some white boys, but then some colored boys as well. So as we explained in the previous episode. If you haven't listened to the Elon Musk episode, so much of this will make sense in that context, by the way. But so, for example, in South Africa, colored is a specific designation for mixed race people. And so they used to go out and they would drink and smoke weed and sit out in the field and hang out. And then on that day, the boys attacked not just Kirsty, but her friend as well, and they attacked them, they stabbed them, and they tried to burn them. The two girls managed to make it back home alive, but then Kirsty was so burnt and she had suffered significant lung damage as well that she dies afterwards. Now, this gets written up as a satanic ritual case, and over again, the media is talking about Satanism and so on and so on. But as Falkof points out, it's because the media couldn't, and society in general couldn't confront this as a gender-based violence case, right? And because that would have forced conversations around misogyny, around poverty, around the lack of social support structures that make these GBV cases so prevalent and so violent in South Africa. So even today, because 2011 really is not that long ago, and if you go into certain churches and so on, people are still having hands laid on them to cast out demons. And people are still having massive structural problems in the country described as the work of the devil. And the sensationalist approach to these problems is a way of avoiding talking about the root causes, right? Especially the root causes of violence against women. So this is by no means something that's over.
Of course, it's so much easier to, literally demonize something rather than sociologically demonize something. It's very bizarre, but yeah, humans.
So, today you will see TikToks where young people are warning each other about such and such a musician has satanic symbols in her pop music, so you're not allowed to listen to that, otherwise the demons will literally come out of the radio and infect you. So many cases of actual murder and so on get sensationalized on WhatsApp as ritual killings, etc., etc. Again, no evidence is actually offered, right? And when I was growing up, I would grow up in a church where every now and then there would be a service and they would make a huge bonfire and they'd throw in CDs and books. I'm talking about books about yoga. Anything to do with New Age. Yes, anything to do with New Age religion, anything to do with anything that is esoteric and not core Calvinist Christianity is considered Satanism and so has to go into the bonfire. As I said, things as ridiculous as wearing jeans was for the longest time considered to be you outing yourself as a Satanist. I remember having hands laid on me and getting prayed for and having demons cast out of me. And I remember at some stage confronting my parents and saying, what did you think was demon possession at that time? And she basically describes the symptoms of ADHD, and she basically describes neurodivergency as symbols of Satanism. And this wasn't just happening to me, it was happening to all my friends all the time. So this bizarre belief that no matter how Christian you are as a parent, no matter how well you adhere to doctrine and your faith, no matter how strong your faith is, your children are constantly at danger of having the devil jump into them from absolutely anything. Two other very memorable freakouts from my particular church that I grew up in, and obviously someday we'll talk about it in detail because it's a very interesting church. They absolutely freaked out over Harry Potter, obviously.
And of course.
Pokemon. And the problem with Pokemon was that obviously because we lived in a very protected and sheltered, even for South Africa, a very sheltered environment, we weren't allowed to watch TV, we weren't allowed to listen to just any old radio, it had to be Christian radio and so on and so on. You would still think, you'd think that that's enough, right, to basically keep the devil at bay, but no, the devil could come in. So there's a brand of chips called Simba chips, or crisps, I guess people will call them around the world. And because they were putting Pokemon cards in there as collectibles, those cards were the devil. And so someone at the school had an epileptic episode. Epilepsy, which everybody knew what it was, he obviously had a satanic attack. We were not allowed to have Simba chips at school or at the mission, actually, until Simba removed Pokemon out of them.
Wow, that's crazy. You know what I was just thinking about some of this? There's like being a teenager like wasn't a thing really until like 1930s America. I mean, even childhood
Yeah.
is a relatively kind of new concept, right?
Yes.
There was, for so much of human history, it's just you're born, and once you're, old enough to really do anything, you're working on the family farm, or then
Yeah.
later on in the Industrial Revolution, you're in the factory. And yeah, like just how much of this is just, what? Like, I mean, being a teenager is horrible. I don't think anyone has a great
Yeah.
time at being a teenager. And like teenagers are weird and do weird shit and don't understand what's happening to them and don't understand the world, but think they know everything. And yeah, I think that just when you kind of think about this, some of this stuff, I can just almost see it as being a reaction, like as society, we still don't really understand teenagers or know what it is or how bizarre the whole thing is. And so, yeah, it's just, yeah, you can kind of see how this stuff just tends, instead of people forming a reasonable explanation that life is hard and weird, it just winds up being, well, yeah, obviously the devil's in town.
Right, yeah. And it almost echoes as far back as the Salem witch trials. How many of those how many of the victims and how many of the people that went after were young women and teenage girls, So yeah, the conclusion for me is that there has never been a society on earth that desperately needs therapy as much as South Africa does. And this isn't just the satanic panic basically isn't just the fear of the changes that have happened in South Africa and so on. I think in many ways, as I say, that we grew up under the shadows of the satanic panic, the afterglow, so to speak, right? Such that when the Harry Potter movies are coming out, we're still talking about this stuff and we're still hearing it all the time. But it's a society that can't really deal with structural inequality. We don't know how to do it. It's a society that went from this absolute childlike trust in the government and what the government says to today the inability to trust anything that is organized on a public level, that's organized on a social level. It's the inability to deal with gender-based violence. We come up with all these ridiculous explanations when really we need to tackle the things as they exist and as they, name the problem and deal with it directly. And because my fear is that these things will the satanic panic will keep on coming back as long as we're unable to just be normal about things. And, I'm pointing out, as I said earlier, that a huge part of this was South Africa finally joining globalization, right? And influences coming into the country and changing young people, especially. This is still happening till today, right? And people don't know how to interpret this properly, and they don't know how to deal with the fact that their children naturally are going to be different from them, which is just a natural part of the globalization movement, if I call it that way, or the phenomenon. I said earlier that this was very much a white society thing that happened, and there are different ways in which Black people are unable to interpret globalization, and they're unable to interpret their children being very different from the way that they are and the way that they grew up, not because someone has come in and infected anybody, but because that's just the natural way in which society evolves. And, with the way that the economic situation in the world appears in my eyes to be getting worse and worse and worse, and even in South Africa, the idea that we might be a generation that passes on less economic prosperity to our children than what we have now, that's very real, right? We can all feel that. And so I am terrified of us reaching to the devil and to Satan once again as the explanation for what's going on, because obviously you're just going to end up hurting just crazy number of people once again, like the preschool workers in the Michelle Remembers a Moment in America, and like the different people who happen to be gay or just happen to be, I don't know, they just happen to be different in a way that the people who were brought up on the strictures of Calvinism cannot interpret. Those people end up getting hurt. So South Africa, go to therapy. That's what I'm trying to say.
Just on that point you made about the declining living standards, I think that's something we're starting to see across the West at the moment, is like generationally, I don't know if it's like Gen Z or whatever are going to be the first that have lower standards of living than their parents. And yeah, I think you're right, that this is, going to be reflected in psychic damage and these kind of moral panics that are that are very, very dark. And yeah, unfortunately, I think this is something that we're probably going to see repeated in all sorts of horrible ways and in all sorts of places.
I have to say that I am very worried about the way that people talk about the younger generation as we recognize the fact that they're going to face economic deprivation that we didn't, or at least our parents' generation didn't. Because I think millennials are part of this downward economic slide as well. I mean, those of us who came into the world right into post 2008, the talk that people have around incel culture, around isolation, around atomization, these poor kids who had to do high school during COVID-19, and where this isolation really got driven up to a crazy level. We need to be careful about not wokely doing a satanic panic around the younger generation, which is something I'm actually genuinely worried about. I'm starting to hear people find ways of just repeating the same nonsense that we had to grow up under, but this time couch it in the language of psychology and couch it in the language of, scientific realism, but it's just a satanic panic of form, which is not to say that we shouldn't be worried about the effects of especially atomization and social isolation. But my God, there's a way of doing it where you make the problems 100 times worse. And as I say about South Africa, not facing the problem directly, but reaching to the devil as an explanation for what's happening, or, Andrew Tate or whoever is the standard for the devil in this case.
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. I just wanted to do a quick acknowledgements because I forgot that in the last episode, and I'm a journalist, if nothing, and people have to say where they got the information from. So I use 3 articles, which if you have access to the Journal of Southern African Studies, I cannot recommend them enough. The first is by Danielle Dunbar and Sandra Swart, called No Less a Foe Than Satan Himself, The Devil, Transition and Moral Panic in White South Africa, 1989 to 1993. And then the second was, again in the Journal of Southern African Studies, Satan Has Come to Rietfontein, Race in South Africa's Satanic Panic by Nicky Falkof. And the second one by Nicky Falkof is in the Journal of Feminist Media Studies, The Devil Destroyed Us, Satanism and Gender Violence in South Africa by Nicky Falkof. So thank you very much to them and all the work they did.
We can put links to them in the show notes.
Yeah,
for sure.
Perfect. Thanks very much for listening to another episode of Hell to Pay podcast. Please tune in next week and give us a like, give us a comment, give us a rating on your favorite podcast platform. It really, really helps us. And as we grow, because we're still quite fresh, we would really appreciate if you could give us that support. And of course, share this with whoever you think might be interested.
See you next time.